Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 92 of 2-Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip comes to us from special guest, Dave Jackson.
It's 15 minutes. People start to kind of meander in. So these people are here. This is the early audience. They've already chose that you're the presentation you want to see. And I will walk in and I will say, hey, are you here for the next presentation? They'll go, yeah. And I'll go, great. I just want to say thank you so much. I know there are a lot of other presentations going on right now. I'm just really honored that you're here. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? And people look at me like I'm weird, like, I do this and this and that. Well, now I'm getting a better idea. How can I connect my content to my audience? And I'll just walk to the next person. Are you here for the next presentation? Yeah. Oh, hey, thanks so much. I'm Dave. And they're like, yeah, I know. I listen to your show. I'm like, hey, thank you so much for listening to my show. Is there something I could do to make my show better? Or, and just, it sounds weird, but just walking around and introducing myself to people, it makes you like, I don't know, it builds a little bit of connection with your audience. And I don't see anybody else doing that. And so I kind of stole that idea from Penn & Teller. Penn & Teller, I think, are at, I forget the name of the hotel, but they are the longest running Vegas thing ever at this point. They do the opposite. They don't charge people $300 for a meet and greet. They say hello to everybody as they exit. And I went, which I try to do that as well, but I always try to get them on the way in just so I know who I'm talking to. And I might find out something about that and be able to tie an example to that person. So yeah, I'm not sure why people don't do that. And the other thing is, the other great thing, it's a side effect. The nerves that you had because you're just sitting around waiting go away because now you're having conversations with people. And all of a sudden you look up and you go, oh, time for me to go on. Hold on. I'll see everybody later. And you go backstage and come back out.
Stick around. And after the break, we'll hear more from Dave Jackson. About 10 years ago, my team and I were looking at ways to integrate this brand new podcasting thing into our corporate training and brand evangelism efforts for Toshiba. I was already a fan of the medium, so I started to listening to podcasts about podcasting, as you do, to figure out just how we could do it. Ultimately, I turned most of that project over to Tim Garber, who appeared on this show way back in episodes 10 and 11, and who you can still hear today at the end of every episode. But all that is how I found myself listening to Dave Jackson whispering in my ear from the School of Podcasting as I tried to find my way to a taxi at the Philadelphia airport back in 2008. I've been a fan of Dave's work and all he's done for the medium for a long time, and I'm thrilled to have him as a guest on the show today. One of the most important lessons in this chat is that while Dave is an experienced speaker producing tons of content every week, he still gets nervous before a talk. And then he does the talk anyway. He also still takes the time to rehearse, to practice out loud, and to even try out the stage before folks come in. This is the work you get to do as a speaker, to become a good, effective speaker, and to continue to stay an effective speaker, and ultimately become a fantastic speaker who can still get a little better every day. And of course, there's a lot more in this conversation as well. So who is Dave? Dave Jackson started experimenting with audio on the internet in 2004. In 2005, he launched his first podcast and soon launched the School of Podcasting, the internet's first site dedicated to helping people learn the right way to podcast. His accomplishments include more than 3.2 million downloads, over 3,000 podcast episodes. He's been the director of podcasting for New Media Expo. He's been a featured speaker at Podcast Movement every year from 2014 on. He's been a featured and keynote speaker at Podcast Mid-Atlantic and Podfest Orlando. And this year, in 2018, he was inducted into the Academy of Podcasters Hall of Fame. Unlike many other geeks who know how to podcast, Dave's been a technical trainer for over 20 years. That means he not only understands the technology, but he can also explain it in a plain English geek-speak-free environment. He has a bachelor's degree in education from the University of Akron, specializing in technical education. While there are other podcast consultants, Dave believes his experience sets him apart in regards to helping folks make sense of the entire podcasting process. He not only helps with the how, but also explains the why and makes sure new podcasters avoid common podcasting pitfalls. Dave's won awards at Fortune 500 companies for his customer service, and, well, in a nutshell, he cares. So now, let's meet Dave. Hey, Dave, thanks so much for joining me on 2-Minute Talk Tips this week.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, this is awesome. You're a well-known celebrity in the podcast production space, and that is just fantastic. So I guess where I want to start off is, the idea of going out and hosting a podcast or multiple podcasts and speaking to crowds. It's all about engaging with audiences and talking with folks in different ways. So what I want to know is, have you always liked being on the stage and being in front of the crowd?
No. I actually, in high school, I was fired from my first job as a grocery bagger because I was so painfully shy. I had a hard time talking with customers. In fact, if we go back to one of the very first times on stage, when I think it was in 6th grade, I was singing in a choir. And when we got done, I ran to the side of the stage and threw up. So it's just not something I've ever been super comfortable for at the beginning. And I just got kind of thrown into it. My job out of college, I had an electronics degree, and they gave me a job of going out and training people how to run office equipment because I could go out and set up the equipment and then teach them how to run it. And that's kind of where I just got used to talking to small groups of people. And that really wasn't that bad. That was like 4 or 5 people at a time. And then, but it gave me the gift of gab and figuring out how to say things in a way that would make sense to people and understanding who your audience was and then coming up with the topics to fit it in. So that's really where I started kind of doing presentations, was as a copier technician.
And that's what's really interesting about that is first of all, a lot of folks seem to think that just because you're an expert on something, on a product, on a technology, you're easily going to be able to talk to other folks about that and teach them about that. But teaching and speaking are really very different skills from doing a full setup.
Yeah, it is. A presentation, it's always kind of fun because you kind of have to guess in a way, or you're trying to find out who am I talking to so that I can connect my presentation to the audience. But when it's teaching, you kind of have to, hopefully you have a chance of doing that. Or hopefully when I went from being a copier technician, I eventually fell into working in a training department. And so that was a case where you're hoping that your students have taken any prerequisites. So they're where they're supposed to be. So you can pick up right where you're supposed to be and carry on from there.
And that they actually want to be there and haven't just been assigned that class by the boss.
My worst class ever, I got to teach the Massillon, Ohio Police Department Microsoft Word after they just worked 8 hours.
Oh.
And yeah. And the guy walks in, sits down and goes, all right, well, this ought to be fun. I don't want to be here. And I'm like, okay, let's have fun, shall we? Yeah, it was, that was great.
Yeah. Not only are you going to spend more time here, it's going to be about reports, which you already love.
Yes. Yeah, great.
So how did you transition then from doing the training to getting onto the bigger stages?
It was just a case where what I did is I would train our customers how to run the equipment. And what that did is it made a lot of the service calls for those kind of operator error type of service calls go way down. And they're like, wow, this guy seems to know what he's doing. And they then asked me, do you know anything about computers? And I said, well, I used one in college, and that got me into teaching on a Microsoft Office. And that then got me into being kind of geeky and building websites. And it just, every time I turn around, they were giving me some sort of new stage. And, well, the other thing is another one of my hobbies is musician. So I remember when I was probably 15, this is like the best gig ever. You're playing to a pajama party of teenage girls. We moved the couch out of the way. I think I made $10 and I was like, this is the best ever. And then over the years, playing to bigger and bigger places, I wish this was like in 1970 would sound better, but in the early 2000s, I actually opened up for Blue Oyster Cult, which, of course, back then, they're on their way down, we're on our way up. But that was a couple thousand people. And so that was something that I learned, that the bigger the audience, the bigger the movement has to be. Otherwise, you're just this little speck on a stage. So you have to be sure to keep moving, and arms are moving, and anything that's very animated, just because otherwise you're just a little blip on the radar. So a couple different avenues there of me just slowly getting into bigger and bigger stages. I'm also fairly involved in my church growing up. So that got involved with doing different things in services and things like that. So eventually, it's always just bigger and bigger stages. But to this day, I just spoke in DC a couple weekends ago. My hands go absolutely pale and they sweat and they're freezing. And that is just something I've come to understand, that, hey, it must be about 10 minutes before I go on because my hands are freezing and I just want to put on a pair of gloves. And that's just me letting me know that I'm excited to be here. And once I start, I'm fine.
Oh, that's fantastic. What I think is really interesting about that is, first of all, the power of music. It's amazing when and especially in high school and college and a few years after that, as soon as somebody who can play an instrument sits out at a party, it's amazing how people just start forming that circle around them to listen and to be a part of that community. It's really a powerful thing.
Yeah. And for me, I think because of my teaching background, I always saw music as a way to help people. So we played in a band that was kind of rock and bluesy. And for a while we were playing jazz. And I would have people come up and go, you know what? I just had the worst day ever. And I came in here and you guys are making me smile and you're funny and you're entertaining. And I'm just having the best night ever. And to me, that again was like, wow, I just helped somebody's day get better. That is, as much as I love playing music, that was the great thing about it. I was having a blast. And at the same time, I was helping somebody have a better day. So that was like a win-win on that situation.
And it sounds like the other thing that's really interesting there too is when you talk about coming up through church as a kid, one of the things that's really interesting is that as I've looked at some of the other folks who really have driven a lot of the podcast education in the market, when we talk about folks, you have a background in churches as a youth. We look at folks like Cliff Ravenscraft, Daniel J. Lewis. A lot of them have a strong background in the church as having sort of a foundation for eventually getting up and sharing a message over a microphone. Yeah,
I'm not sure if there's some sort of DNA that Christians are more helpful. Hopefully so. That's the way we're supposed to be. But yeah, at one point I actually was taking classes. I was going to be a pastor, and about halfway through I went, you know what? I'm a big fan of God, but this is not my cup of tea. There's actually, sadly, a lot of politics, and I'm a big fan of God. I really, really hate religion. And that's where I went, not my cup of tea. Never mind.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things where I think a lot of the value from speaking is, at least the younger you get up in front of a group of people, the easier it's going to be later in life.
Yeah, I think it's great because when you're young, you have no fear. I mean, we all have fear, but a lot of times we end up doing, I look at stuff I did when I was young and I'm like, wow, that was really stupid. I could have really gotten hurt, but you're young and stupid. That's beautiful of it. So you kind of get over those things and realize, that's not going to be that bad. And so, when you're logical enough and you're mature enough to go, wow, this could be horrendous. Well, you've already done these other things. So you just kind of go, well, I think I could do it. I did that in the past.
So as you got into podcasting and podcast creation, was that more about starting from the content or more about wanting to find your own stage again as you really got in and took advantage of this brand new field at the time?
Well, it's funny because this is back in 2005, and I did exactly what I tell people not to do, which is I got into podcasting for the money. I was going back to school to get my teaching degree. I needed something with flexible hours, and I went, well, at the time I'd heard that podcasting was going to be big and membership sites were going to be big. And I'm like, let's combine that chocolate with that peanut butter and see what happens. And in 2005, not a lot happened because most people didn't know what a podcast was, let alone, do I need an iPod to listen to that? And so, that's how I started it. But for me, it scratches every itch I have. It's kind of geeky because I'm still kind of a technical guy. It's creative. You can be as weird or as just straight as you want to be. And there's no board or there's nobody to say, no, you can't do that. And then I get to help people. And so for me, that's every itch I have. And so when I first started it and my first piece of feedback that was actually like voicemail came from a guy in Nuremberg, Germany, and Michael Van Laar was his name. And I just remember I just about fell out of my chair because I was like, wait a minute, here I am in Ohio in the middle of cowtown nowhere. And there's some guy on the other side of the planet listening to my show and he likes it. And that's when I went, ooh, I'm so in you until the day I die. This is what I'm doing.
It's amazing how it lets you connect with so many people. On my other show, just this morning, I released an episode where I interviewed somebody who was living in Kiev in the Ukraine. And it's just amazing how it can bring the world together and bring people together around things they're passionate about and things that they really care about. So when you're creating a podcast episode or creating a lesson you're going to deliver through a podcast, how is your preparation different from preparing content for a live audience, like your audience in DC?
The biggest one is I'm going to have some sort of slides to enhance what I'm saying, where if it's an audio podcast, I've got the theater of the mind going on. So sometimes I will use that with sound effects and things like that to kind of enhance the presentation. But they're both very similar. There's a great book called Secrets of Dynamic Communication by Ken Davis. And what I love about that book is he's the guy that makes the SCORE conference, but he says every presentation should be able to be boiled down to one sentence. So I did a presentation once at Podcast Movement, and it was every podcast can benefit from editing. That was the basis of my presentation. And then every bullet point, every slide reinforced that statement. Now, sometimes you'll have a presentation with multiple points, but that's how anytime I ever get somewhat I just can't figure out what I'm trying to say, or this seems to go all over the place and I need a little focus. I'm like, okay, what's the one thing I'm trying to say here? And that usually gets me back on track. So I kind of do both of those. And then with a presentation, I kind of, again, try to figure out who my audience is, where they are, and then to the point of nauseum, I practice it over and over and over. And I actually, let's say I get 40 minutes to do a presentation. They're like, yeah, I get 40 minutes and then 15 minutes of questions. I will purposely plan to do it 30 minutes because I'm a little ADD, and somewhere in there, I'm going to see a crowd reaction or whatever, and something's going to pop in my head, and I will call an audible and do something. And so I've learned that over the years, that there's always something Dave's going to do that I'm not planning on, but for whatever reason comes up at the last minute, and I will throw that in. So that always gives me a little bit of a buffer. But that's the other reason why I tend to do these over and over and over, is the more I just keep hitting that same point, something will hit me and I'm like, ooh, you know what? That's a really good analogy, or this is a good story, or something of my past would help illustrate this story. And so by just kind of repeating it, eventually whatever subconsciously bubbles to the top, and I go, ooh, that would work really good here. So on one hand, it's kind of monotonous to just keep doing the same presentation over and over and over. But by the 10th, 15th, 20th time I've done that, I'm really happy with what I've got. And with an episode, I just don't have time to do it 20 times. It's a matter of getting my bullet points, knowing who my audience is. And that comes from just living in my genre. I'm in a lot of Facebook groups. I host a Northeast Ohio podcasters meetup. So I'm always listening to what is my audience talking about, and then trying to find some way of illustrating that point. Like a lot of people want to, quit their day job and do podcasting full time. So when I found somebody who did, I'm like, you have to come on my show and explain how you did it. And so anytime I can, talk to something that I hear, what they're talking about, and I'm like, oh, this will answer that question. I know that's going to be an episode.
That's fantastic. There's there's a lot of really great things in there. I think one thing to really emphasize here is that a lot of speakers or a lot of folks who are just starting to speak at work or at events that they're just passionate about, activities outside of work, it's really helpful to hear that, somebody who gets on the mic every week and produces all of this content by talking about it still goes out and rehearses and has to do the rehearsal to be effective in a live presentation.
Yeah. And it's not enough to read it. Because I will do that at the beginning. I'm like, okay, I've got all my points, but then I've got to make sure it comes out of my mouth. Because there are times when you've got this great point and you go to say it and all of a sudden you're wait, I'm like, that doesn't roll off the tongue. Hold on a second, And with the episode, it's just a matter of that's one thing. When I'm in front of an audience, I might say something like, you guys. Everyone knows this. If it's a podcast, I'm so glad you're here. I'm sure you've done this because I'm talking to one person. And because rarely it's not like the old 30s, like everyone gather around the stereo. We're going to listen to the School of Podcasting. I'm talking to one person. And then when I go to events, I have people come up and they go, I feel like you're talking to me. And I'm like, it's because I am. So I always talk to one person when I'm doing a podcast episode.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. One of the things I've always talked about with presentations is when people at work will say, can you send me the presentation beforehand, or can you send me the presentation afterwards? The answer is no, I can't, because a presentation is not a PowerPoint slide deck. It is an activity that happens in a specific place at a specific time with a group of people that is essentially a short-term community all experiencing that presentation. And I think that's what, when you can talk to all of you folks, all you guys, all of this at once, versus that one single person you're addressing on the podcast, I think that draws that interesting contrast between that communal experience and that more personal, intimate experience.
Yeah, and I've gone away as much as I can from the bullet point PowerPoint presentation. A lot of times I will have a single word on a slide. That's it. Because I want them looking at me. I don't want them sitting there reading my slide. Or I'll have a picture of whatever I'm talking about. If I'm talking about a connection, it might be a child sitting on a father's lap or something like that. It's a picture, but in the end, I still want them looking at me and I'm looking at them to make sure I'm connecting, as opposed to them just going, oh, there's another bullet point. Or my favorite, it was somebody puts a bunch of bullet points all up at the same time. Well, your audience can read faster than you talk, and then you turn your back to them and read the bullet points to them. I want to just stab myself in the face when I see that. I can't take it. When people go, can you send me the slide deck? I'm like, you do realize the first 10 slides are just pictures. Like if you, without me to explain what those are, it's like, why do you have a picture of Mario Brothers? It's like, it's part of the, it doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. The other thing that you mentioned there that's just so important is that idea of boiling it down to one sentence. I think in Carmine Gallo's book about TED Talks, he talks about you need to be able to define your entire talk in a tweet. That whole idea of that core message being what drives everything else, I think is so important, regardless of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And then if I have any time beforehand, like a lot of times, let's say I go on after lunch, so the room is empty during lunch, I will go in beforehand, get on stage without a microphone, and just go through it one more time in my head. I'm going to stand here, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to, whatever I'm doing, and just walk through the whole presentation, because now I know exactly what I'm going to be doing, what it looks like, and just start getting that visualization going on of like, this is how it's going to work, and I'm going to do this and that whole 9 yards. So if I can do that, just again, get one more practice in, now it's like a dress rehearsal, minus the microphone. Just to make sure everything's working, make sure your projector plugs in correctly to your laptop or whatever you're using, and make sure the batteries are good and the clicker, that whole 9 yards. I always try to do that. Just one more time.
Find all the issues before actual go time.
Yeah, nothing more fun than in the middle going, oh, wait, hold on, wait, oh, that's not, yeah, so.
I think at least 80% of the videos that people try to show in presentations, the sound does not come through because somebody hasn't checked it beforehand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's or they have the YouTube video but there's no Wi-Fi at the hotel. So it's like, well, if we could have gone to YouTube, it was a picture of it's a cat playing the piano. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Not going to work. Yeah.
Exactly. A big part of your business these days is teaching people more about podcasting. And obviously has been for a long time with the School of Podcasting. And podcasting, of course, has a lot of gear, all the assorted software and services and techie stuff that those of us who have been doing it for a little while really love to talk about and get deep into. But it is quite the rabbit hole to dive into, especially for new folks who just really have a story to share or a message to share. How do you help those tech-averse folks become comfortable with this world of stuff that helps and can at the same time get in the way of sharing their story?
Yeah, it's especially if you get into a mixer. When you look at it, the average mixer, there's probably somewhere between 20 and 30 buttons on that or knobs to turn. And you will see people literally just start to wet their pants right in front of you. And there are some people that I'm like, okay, that's good. I had somebody a couple weeks ago that was in that situation. She's like, there's no way, just mentally blocked. I'm not going to be able to do this. And so I looked again at like, okay, what are you trying to do? I want to connect. I want to interview people over Skype or Zoom or whatever. And I said, okay. And so I said, let's use a Focusrite 2i2, which has, I think, 5 knobs on it. She had a portable recorder. So it was kind of like, and you plug the microphone in, you turn it on till it turns green. When it turns red, back it down a little bit. And when it comes ready to record, hit that big record button. And I was able to talk her through it. And I mean, I remember, again, because I've been doing this, I remember when email was new. You know, there was it wasn't Gmail, Novell something, group mail. And people are like, what's this email thing or what's this fax thing? And we've always had these weird learning curves. And I always tell people, if you've used Microsoft Word, then you can use WordPress. If you've ever been in the car and your jam is on and you're going to town with the music and the phone rings, well, you turn the music down so you can hear the phone up. You know how to mix audio. Nobody has ever been on the phone and you call up and go, hello, this is Dave. And they go, you sound horrible, and hang up on you. So I know you hate the sound of your voice, but it's worked so far for your whole life. So we have really the skills to podcast. Now, I'm not going to say there's no learning curve, but we have the basics to build on. And so that's sometimes when I talk people through. I remember once I had a housewife in Florida. And she just said, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this. I said, trust me, we're going to baby step through this whole thing. And I remember she called me one day crying. And I said, what's going on? What's the matter? She goes, I'm in iTunes. And I go, And she goes, no, I'm in iTunes. I can't believe, So that to me just put so much gas in my tank. So yeah, it's one of those things. It's actually a physical thing, like why you hate your voice, because, and this sounds weird, you're actually listening partly through your skull. So it actually makes your voice sound bassier. So when you hear your voice for the first time, just using your ears, because it's coming out of a speaker, it's always going to sound thinner and weird. And I'm always telling people it's not weird, it's different. And so, and you just have to kind of push through some of those. And
after you've edited or gone through 10 or 15 of your episodes, it stops bugging you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing. People are like, I don't want to sound stupid. I'm like, it's not radio. It's not live. So if you say something stupid, I actually put my bloopers now at the end just to let people know, like, look, I'm not perfect. I did one last week where I was talking about a coupon. And I said, go to the School of Podcasting and use the coupon code SOP free. I go, that's the wrong coupon. Hold on. And just put it at the end. And I'm like, see, it's like, I didn't have it written down. And I've had people say, I'm so glad you do that, because I always thought, I was just hitting record and everything out of my mouth was gold. And I'm like, no, absolutely not.
And that's one of those other really interesting things too. With recording a podcast, obviously you have the ability to edit, but you don't have that ability when you're doing a live presentation. No. So when those things happen during a live presentation or through a live talk, how do you handle that?
I plan on it. I was on TV once, and I just told myself I was practicing. That was a whole weird presentation, because you almost have to memorize your answer, because it has to be exactly 3 minutes and 18 seconds long. It's really weird. And so I kept practicing it on the drive up, and I kept messing it up. And I just said, okay, right now we're just going to say it's okay when I miss a line or something like that, and don't lose it, and just go, yep, there it is. And sure enough, we're doing it. And I went to say something about the mail. Instead, I said newspaper for whatever reason. My brain just, and I said, and it's something like if you go to the mail, and I said, oh, actually a better example would be newspaper. In my head, I'm like, oh, there it is, done. You can cross that off the list. When I was I was lucky enough this year to get inducted into the Hall of Fame. And you want to talk about something I practiced over and over and over. And I was super just ready. I wanted it to just nail it. And I got up and said the word choosing. I made up a new word, choosing instead of chose. And I just said, hey, look, I'm making up new words. And I heard my audience laugh. And I went, you know what? In my head, of course, I'm saying, what are you worried about? You are in a room filled with your friends who are here to support you. And I was just like, just relax and just be you. That's what got you here. Just be you and chill out. And there's a great video. It's really sad. It's Garth Brooks, but the guy from Pure Prairie League, and he sings in Vince Gill. Vince Neil's in Motley Crue. Totally different guy. But he's singing at George Jones's
That's
funeral.
more of a duet with Chris Gaines.
Yeah, exactly. And it's Vince Gill, and he's singing this song called Go Rest High on the Mountain. So it's a really sad song. He was good friends with George Jones, and the guy just can't make it through the song. He's just losing it. And it's really hard to watch. And so about the time he just can't do it, Garth Brooks stands up, kind of like, I got you, brother. We're here for you. And I always remember that now. It's like, if you start to mess up in a presentation, your audience isn't there going, oh, I can't believe this. Who let this guy on the stage? No, they want you to pull through because they want your content. I was at a presentation in Australia, and unfortunately somebody had the dreaded half-dead clicker. And so she's clicking away at it, and she was kind of embarrassed, but we all knew, hey, it's not your fault. It's not like you bought the batteries. It's whoever's the AV person is. So we were all just pulling for her, and she kind of did a little tap dance while they put new batteries in, and off she went, and it was going. So for me, like I said, I just plan that there's always going to be something that I go, yep, that didn't come out exactly right. And I just go, all right, that's done. Now we can go, now we can take perfect off the table because we knew that probably wasn't going to happen. And now it's just focus on making this the best presentation ever.
That's awesome. And when you can go back to that key point, that key message you were trying to land to begin with, it gives you a nice jumping off point to recenter even if something does go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always, what's the old saying? There's the presentation you plan on, the presentation you actually give, and then the presentation you wish you had given. So I always try to avoid too much of a gap between those.
Right. And in many cases, the fourth type is the presentation the audience actually experienced, which can be completely different from their perceptions.
Absolutely.
So another part of your business is, as part of this training and part of working with folks live is you also produce online courses and make those courses available. So can you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
That came about because in my job, they had just started with like computer-based training. You would burn things onto a CD, and I'd started using Camtasia Studio and was pretty good at making online these little tutorials and such. And then they moved to online, and that was when it was like, ooh, now I don't have to ship you a CD or a DVD or things like that. And so when it came up with the idea of the School of Podcasting, I'm like, look, I can teach people how to do this. I can make an online course. I had to kind of figure out how to piece apart some sort of website that I could charge people money for and how to protect it and things of that nature. And so for me, it was just a natural extension of my training background. And at the time, there just wasn't anything. And I went, well, if supply and demand is still in effect here, there's not a lot of demand yet because nobody understands what the heck a podcast is, but I'm going to give this a shot. And so it's just a matter of going back and kind of not like the one statement, but like at the end of this little tutorial, I want my student to be able to do blank. And then it's a matter of creating, whether it's PDFs or workbooks or a video or an audio, something they have to listen to that's going to give them the skills to be able to do that particular item. And so that just goes back to my training. That's just good old, there's a thing called the ADDIE approach. You analyze, decide, design. I used to know this, implement and evaluate.
Yep. Design, develop, implement, evaluate.
Yeah. So that's, to me, I went to school for that. I'm like, oh, I just called that common sense. Okay. But if you want to call it the Addy approach, that's great. And so I always do that. I'm always looking for ways to make it better. And then the fun thing with the School of Podcasting, which I will be doing this weekend, is about every time you go, all right, everything's caught up. They go, oh, new version of WordPress. And I'm like, got to go back and do that part of this, or there's a new tool or something comes out. So that's probably one of my biggest struggles is I like to advertise my tutorials are up to date, not like YouTube, which has stuff from 2012 that's horrendously bad advice at this point. So I have to keep things up to date.
And doing it online at least means you don't have a stack of expired CDs in your garage waiting to ship out anymore.
Exactly. And then it's just a matter of having a relationship with your customer to, I do live group coaching. I use Zoom for that. And so I will ask somebody like, hey, I see, because I can see, I use a system called Thinkific, and I can see what classes they've gone through. So when I see so-and-so has gone through the monetization course, but they went through 3/4 of it, I can say, hey, I see you only went through 3/4 of that. Did you learn everything you need to learn, or were you stuck on something? And so I'm always looking for feedback, that evaluation part of the Addy approach, to make sure that I'm giving them exactly what I need or what they need.
One of the things about that is the tools have come such a long way from when the early days of online training and trying to get Camtasia files then online, and Camtasia itself has evolved to allow a lot more interaction and inside quizzes and highlighting and all sorts of other cool things, but it's made it a lot more accessible to the point where now folks who may have an expertise in something, maybe they're still working their corporate career and maybe they want to continue their corporate career, but want to sort of share some of their passions, help other folks be more effective at something. Is developing and producing online courses something that's really feasible for someone just sort of starting their entrepreneurial journey, or are there other things they should be doing first? Is that sort of like a mid-step if you're really sharing your expertise? Obviously, starting a podcast can be, one of the great first steps, but in terms of monetization, selling online courses can certainly be an element of that.
Yeah, it's a great tool, and that's where podcasting and courses works really, really well, because you can kind of show your expertise in a podcast by talking about, I always say, especially for businesses, I'm like, those questions that people ask all the time that you just like, oh, somebody asked again about the such and such. Well, that's an episode. And that way you can still answer that question when they ask it again and say, it's such and such. We talked about this in our podcast. Here's a link to that episode. So don't blow off the answer. Still give them the answer. But for more information, click here. Well, now they go over, they listen to that. Oh, and there's more episodes. And now you have a more educated customer. So when they come back, they don't have as many questions, and they're also more informed on your product. So for me, I always say a solo show builds your credibility with your audience. And then when you do interviews, it builds your network. And so, it's which one comes first? Boy, that's a tough one, because I would say almost start the podcast first, because that will get the conversation going, unless you know already what your audience needs. And if I build this course, they will buy it. I would start maybe with the podcast, get some feedback. And then also what that allows you to do is maybe get one of those super fans that emails you all the time and say, hey, the course is done. Would you be willing to go through the course and then talk about it like I'm not in the room, but I'm going to be in the room, because I really need to know, what you think of that. So yeah, courses are great. Books are okay. But books are like podcasts. Writing the book is the piece of cake. It's getting people to read it that's tough. So courses are good. And then consulting is just something, half the stuff I used to do, it just came about from somebody going to the School of Podcasting and going, I like your courses and stuff, but my situation is different. Is there any way I could just get some time with you? And I'm like, okay. And then for a while, I used to do audio editing. Somebody would go, I like this whole talking into the microphone thing, and I can publish it and all, but this editing thing drives me crazy. Do you know of anybody who would do that for me? Yes, that would be me again. So when I first started off and there weren't that many podcasters, I was making up the difference in consulting and editing and all sorts of other things that people said, do you know of anybody who would do this? Yes, that would be me. And sometimes that's where the idea for the product that you didn't even think about, but because you're now knee deep in your niche, that somebody goes, do you know if anybody does this? And you go, ooh, I don't think anybody does. Maybe I'll do that. And now you've got your product for your customer.
Yeah, that's a great way of approaching it. And again, it's about listening to your audience. What are they talking about? What are they needing? And paying attention to their answers to find where the value is missing and how you can make that up.
Yeah. I interviewed Kathy Heller on an episode, and she's a musician, and it's hard to make a job in music these days. And so she had actually been signed to 2 major labels and also dropped, unfortunately. And so she just saw where a lot of musicians were getting their music into commercials, into TV shows and movies. And she just looked at like, okay, that's where the audience is now. What kind of music do they need for, movies, for TV commercials, and for TV shows? And she saw that her music really wasn't that far off. And so again, here's what the audience needs. Can I deliver that? And she did. And now she makes like 6 figures. And she's also then started a course teaching people. So she found out, hey, I'm going to make this what my audience needs. And then people said, well, wait, how did you do that? And she said, oh, and so she started a course teaching people what she did. So had she not jumped into that genre to find out that, oh, there's a need here, she wouldn't have known to make a course.
So how do you navigate the world of doing that and adapting to what your customer needs versus the idea that I think we probably especially have as adolescents and early 20s, that this is art, and adapting what we do just because the audience and the customers want it, that's selling out?
It really depends on, do you want to eat or not? And I guess that is selling it. And there are plenty of people. I remember the early days of, like in 2005, when I went to my first podcast convention, and a friend of mine named Paul Culligan and I walked in and said, you know what? If we had enough listeners, you might be able to sell sponsorship for somebody. And we literally got tarred and feathered. They're like, it's art, man. What are you talking about? Exactly that thing. And so if you want, and that's the beautiful thing, there are no rules in podcasting. If you want to do your art, that's fine. But if that's not what your audience is willing to pay for, well, then you got a problem. Yoko Ono, quote, sings. That's what she says. It sounds to me like she's been lit on fire, but she's calling it singing. I'm not paying for that, but somebody appreciates that somewhere. And so it might take a little more marketing, a little more time to find your target audience to do whatever your quote art is. And not every podcast has to make money. One of my more popular shows is really weird. It's a show called Building a Better Dave. And I started it because I was going to do online dating. Well, the third person I dated, I ended up marrying. And it's just been, I always say it's where I get to talk about whatever the heck I want. And I don't care about monetization. It's just, a lot of times I just say, look, it's cheaper than therapy. And there are episodes that are definitely me just sharing what's on my mind, and I think it's weird and it's therapy, and I'm just throwing it out to the universe. And I have so many people go, that's what I love about it. It's just you being kind of weird at times. And for $7 a month for media hosting, that's, holy cow, that's a 15-minute, if not, that's 5 minutes of therapy. So not every show has to make money. A lot of times you get paid in opportunities, you get paid in all sorts of other ways besides money.
And when you set those expectations for a show like that to begin with, it becomes essentially a lot easier when you've lowered your own expectations. It really is a great way to get that inner critic out of the way when you think, I'm just going to put this out there for me, for whatever. And you don't have to worry about, is this wrong? Is this going to help my brand? Is this going to hurt me? Is this going to be valuable to the listeners or not? If it's for me, then it's easier.
Absolutely. And I always say, because I've had people go, well, I'm doing a show and, people seem to be listening and they seem to like it, but, I'm not making any money at this. And I go, well, okay, did you set out to do that? And they're like, well, no, not really. I just like talking about this subject. And I'm like, it'd be like going up to somebody who's flying a kite and going, wow, that kite's really up there. Wow, good job on that. And somebody goes, yeah, I love to fly kites. It's always windy here and this is a great spot. And they go, okay, how much money are you making with that kite? It's like, wait, I'm not making I used to bowl back in the day. I used to lose a lot of money bowling, but I had a great time doing it. So a lot of people, and because it's a great way to market your business and your products, and it's a great way to reach the world and things like that. But you don't have to make money with a podcast.
That is awesome. I'm sure that's reassuring to an awful lot of folks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, as you travel to conferences around the world, everywhere from DC to Northeast Ohio to Australia, what are some of the most common mistakes you see other speakers making?
In some cases, I hate to see when people give out advice that they themselves have not researched. I've seen information go out that I'm like, that's not, and it's stuff that if they had taken 10 minutes to do a little research. I'll give you an example. When somebody says, hey, you want to launch your podcast with 10 episodes because if somebody subscribes, you get 10 downloads. I've heard that not a lot from presenters, but I've heard it from other people, but I have heard it from a stage. That is so easy to debunk. Because when you subscribe, depending on the app, you might download the latest episode, but you're definitely not downloading the other 9. And so that always makes me kind of cringe at times. And depending on the conference, I try my best not to sell a lot, where it's just like, schoolofpodcasting.com, blah, 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 and it's just, spewing the speech and I always tell people the reason I don't make as much money as some of the other podcast consultants is because I'm a trainer. I'm not a marketer. And so that's just my own personal thing. And I don't know if that's a mistake or not. That's my own personal opinion. I don't like to sell from stage, but on the other hand, I don't have a wife and 3 kids. So I might understand if somebody else has a wife and 3 kids, why they need to sell a little harder from the stage. But other than that, most of the places I go, I don't see most of the places. The speakers are pretty well, I don't know what the word is, vetted maybe. They've kind of gone through some sort of approval process that it's not too bad. I've seen one where somebody had memorized their presentation and it was almost like a play where they were doing their part and they were doing their presentation and they had the dramatic pause and then they were doing this and it was very much, but the thing was, and I went, wait a minute, they went back and started the sentence over. And that's when I went, this is obviously memorized. And they forgot where they were at. And instead of picking up where they left off, they actually went back to the beginning of the sentence. And I went, oh, and that's when it dawned on you like, oh, wait. And it was just, he wasn't talking to me. He was presenting. And that's to me, I was like, okay. So for me, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And that's another fun thing is teachers, nurses make horrible patients, teachers make horrible attendees because we will just pick you to death. We're back there going, oh, he didn't, his stage presence or there's no dynamics in his voice or whatever. We just pick you apart. Same thing with musicians. There's always a bunch of musicians at the back of the bar with their arms crossed and they're just looking you over. So, that's just part of the gig.
Right. The other thing that also gets really interesting about that is that when we observe something we're an expert in, it's hard for us to be in the moment because we're also doing that meta-analysis in the background about what would we do? What is this? What's happening here? I see why they did that. Instead of laughing at a joke, we're like, oh, that's very clever.
Yeah, I do a show. I started it as a test called the Podcast Rodeo Show, and it's where I grab a random podcast and see how long I can hang on, hence the rodeo reference. and it's kind of weird because, and I will listen to it for a little bit and then give, like, here's my first impression of this. And it's really hard because I can't help it. I listen through the ears of a podcaster. And there are times when I'm like, your noise gate is set a little too aggressive and it's cutting off the end of the word. And I'm like, the average Joe Schmo in his car is not going to notice that. So I try to tune out the podcaster part of me and just go, all right, and just try to listen as normal as I can. But yeah, I totally agree with you. We are who we are and we bring our own little baggage.
Fantastic. So Dave, if folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
Schoolofpodcasting.com is pretty much all my contact information, all my podcasts, all my courses. Everything's at that same site, schoolofpodcasting.com.
So Dave, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been fantastic.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
That was quite a thrill for me. You can find all of Dave's shows over at powerofpodcasting.com or go straight to the big show at schoolofpodcasting.com. Or just go to 2minutetalktips.com/Dave to find all of Dave's links. So, I told you at the beginning what I heard from our conversation with Dave. What did you hear from Dave today? Let us know in the comments over at 2minutetalktips.com/Dave. Check out Dave's School of Podcasting if you're thinking of starting a show or just want to learn more about the insides of a podcast. Next time you're speaking, greet the early arriving audience members personally. Share this episode with anyone thinking of starting a show by giving them the link 2minutetalktips.com/Dave. Of course, subscribe to 2 Minute Talk Tips for free in your favorite podcast app. And, of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
Two-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.